it has to be borne in mind that the Gospels were written by witnesses, or I should correct that slightly. 3 of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and John, were written by apostles, intimates of Jesus, or very close disciples in the case of Mark. Luke did not know Jesus personally, but he knew Paul and Peter and most of the other apostles, and appears on the scene very quickly, which is the second thing to emphasize. These accounts were written within a generation, 25 years of the death and resurrection of Christ. That is to say, Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written that early. John was written somewhat later, perhaps another 25 years. But John, the beloved disciple, supplies so many more intimate details that you could argue, I think, very convincingly, that his is the best biographical narrative. The rest of the New Testament, the Acts of the Apostles, which adheres most closely to a historical narrative, and the various epistles, climaxing with that most obscure book, the Apocalypse, the book of Revelations of St. John, give us some idea of the kind of life that the early Christians led, and the kind of people they were. But you have to remember about the epistles and other material in the New Testament aside from the Gospels, and this includes the Acts of the Apostles, which, as I said a moment ago, comes closest to being conventional history. You have to bear in mind that they have the same object as the Gospels. They aren't there to satisfy your intellectual curiosity and mine. They're there to proclaim the good news and to bring before the Jews and pagans of the time the messianic message which those writing these epistles were convinced was the truth of God. But there is history too. We learn quite a lot from the other books of the New Testament about the kind of people the early Christians were. We are instructed about, for example, their dedication to religious exercises which center in 2 things: reading the Scriptures and partaking of what they called the breaking of the bread. That is to say, the germ of, or the memorial to the Last Supper, and which in turn points to the Eucharist and the sacrifice of the Mass. We know that in the very earliest times, that is to say right after the ascension of Christ, that there were 120 Christians. That's how it all started, all living in Jerusalem, all indeed having to face the difficulties that follow upon a radical movement being unacceptable to the majority of the population. Keeping all things, we read, in common. They owned their property, or they contributed their property in such a way that they were able to live together harmoniously. That did not last. And we know from the pages of the New Testament that it could not last. As the Christian evangel spread out of Palestine and into the rest of the Mediterranean world, as tens and hundreds and ultimately thousands of people became Christians, no longer could one think of this sort of idyllic situation in which 120 people could live this utopian common life. One thing that should be of great consolation to us Catholics of the last decade of the 20th century, who seem to be so riven by disputes and conflicts and sometimes bitter disagreements on issues of great importance, that the early Christians faced the same kind of problems. The dissidents were everywhere. Perhaps the most famous of them and the most pernicious of them were a group called the Docetists, who said that surely a divine person could not have suffered what Jesus suffered, and therefore it must all be a kind of an image, a kind of pretense that Jesus looked like a real human being, but he wasn't. There was a kind of shadowy film around him, as it were. Well, of course, if that were the case, the whole Christian position collapses. The most severe and terrible crisis that the Christians in the very first generation had to deal with was how to amalgamate the vast numbers and increasing numbers of Gentile converts to what had begun as a Jewish experience. And there were no precedents. There was no way that anybody could figure this out in a way that could call upon past experience. There'd never been anything like this before. And so this Judaizing crisis was the greatest one. It even occasioned a quarrel between St. Peter and St. Paul, who didn't seem to be able to be on the same wavelength on this issue. And it finally came to a dramatic and quite wonderful and quite inspiring conclusion when the apostles gathered together in Jerusalem to thrash this matter out, to give, in other words, the lead for all the ecumenical and apostolical councils to follow, including the one in our lifetime, the Second Council of the Vatican. And they thrashed all this out, and they decided that only in essentials, and that was even vaguely defined, would Gentile converts need to identify their Jewish roots. And that really went without saying. But the interesting thing is the way in which the apostles in their council at Jerusalem phrased their decision. They said, it is pleasing to the Holy Spirit and to us that this decision be made. They didn't hesitate to take upon themselves the mantle of authority. And we should not hesitate to grasp our history. We cannot escape it. We should not want to escape it. It leads us, it foretells for us a participation in the communion of saints to which we all look forward.